Hi, I'm John LaRue, the Manager of Collections and Exhibitions here at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, and welcome to another episode of Conversations here at the Beaverbrook, where we meet with an important New Brunswick artist and we talk about work that's in our permanent collection. And today it's our great pleasure to have a wonderful friend of the arts in New Brunswick, and certainly the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, Peter Powning. And Peter is the victim of one of our latest books that we just put out this past year with Goose Lane, of Peter Powning, a retrospective. And this is the catalog to a retrospective that we're planning of 50 years of his work. And it was unfortunately delayed a bit by COVID, but this will be touring around New Brunswick starting next year and going to Ontario as well. So one of the great artists, certainly in Canada, winner of the Bronfman Award for his service to fine craft and Canadian culture, Peter Powning.
Hi, John.
Great to have you, Peter.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Yeah.
It's now my 52nd year retrospective, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. We'll add those other 2 years. But it was great. I mean, really got to know you very well working with this.
Yeah.
And certainly as a friend and a colleague. And I appreciate your work so much and respect it. And it is incredible to think you have half a century of work. I mean, how do you, does it make you feel old?
It's a bit baffling, I have to admit. I don't feel like I should have 50 years under my belt, but there it is.
Yeah. So back in the day, we'll get into this just quickly, is you came from the United States, born and raised in America. You and your wife Beth moved to Markham, so Pride of Markhamville, just outside of Sussex, New Brunswick. Yeah. And you arrived there in the early 1970s, and you never left. You've been there the entire time.
No, we bought the place in 1970, and it seems like ancient history. We grew up here, really. I mean, we spent our entire adult lives here and feel very lucky.
How much of that is in your work? I mean, that sense of place, because when I look at these, people know you for your Raku work, your glass work, your bronze. I call you one of the greatest polymaths in Canadian art. There's almost no medium, even photography, there's no medium you don't touch on. And certainly Beth with literature, you know, the printed word. But you know, these are all made in this very particular place.
Yeah, well, place is really key to our lives, and it finds its way into the work. And there's not a day we're not out in the woods or working in the garden. We live a very rural life. It kind of hinges on, it's an odd life in the sense that, you know, we live a very rural life, grow a lot of our own foods, live on an old farm, have animals, but it also pivots around all these other axes, like Toronto's been big in
public art in Toronto. I mean, mammoth skyscraper public art, so the Toronto Film Festival.
Well, and before that even by the 80s, I was showing by the late 70s, I was showing in Toronto and sold through Prime Gallery, which was a big influence early, and then Sandra Ainsley Gallery, and in the States later. So it's our center, it's our core, it's kind of the heartbeat of our lives, and informs the work quite a bit, but there are other things angling in as well.
Yeah, constantly. So in the series, we typically have spoken about one particular work of an artist in our permanent collection. So we have two of yours. I'm sure we'll get more someday, but the two that we own are the larger ones in the back, the bronze and stumped glass work here, Punctuated Integer, which is from 2002. And then the round one in the back, in the cast glass, which was given to us just this year, but it's called Core Basin from 1992. So the ones in front you've brought with you as examples of other things you've worked on, because you can't talk about your work and your career by just talking about one. It would leave 90% of the type of things you've worked on out. But you know, I mean, with the different mediums, even here, there's metal, there's glass. You know, you've worked sometimes with, you know, there's wood, plaster, you know, metal leaf, although some gold leaf on Core Basin as well. But what do you think makes you so curious and constantly exploring all of these mediums? You know, you're not Henry Moore that just did bronze his whole life. You've got, you know, 20 different things you worked with.
I don't know what makes me curious. It may be a certain kind of restlessness as well, but I mean, I see things and I'm curious about them and how I react to it. I think I felt confined by the idea of just sticking with a material, and that kind of defines what I do and my ideas. And there's also a kind of limitations can be a discipline, but they can also be limitations. And so there are frustrations with all materials. I mean, glass can drive you crazy because it's so difficult to get it to do what you want. It breaks. But on the other hand, it has this fantastic fluidity. And bronze, if you break it, you can weld it. And you can change the color. And if you don't like it, you just get the torch out. Yeah, you can chuck it back in the crucible. And so there are qualities that all of these materials have. And I was curious from fairly early about using them in combinations. And that really worked for me.
Talk about that maybe with punctuated imagery here. So it's a monumental sculpture. It's only 2 feet tall, but it reads as something you'd find in Mesopotamia. And I know you also bring a lot of the idea of kind of runes, ancient runes, and sort of these marks on there as well, which there are some. But tell us about the genesis of this and this sort of type of work that you do from the early 2000s. And it reminds me of some of the larger public sculptures you've done as well, which is similar to that.
Well, a lot of that sort of monumental feeling work, especially the stelaform, comes from that idea of markers, I guess. The idea of like a cairn. They demark something. I'm not sure what, but they have this sense of portent, I guess. It's
I don't even know what portent means. Like Muhammad Ali, what does that mean?
You're putting me on the spot now.
Yeah.
It has a sense of kind of
gravitas, or that is.
Well, portent is portents of things to come. Like it indicates an indicator of things, and and really, honestly, with my work, I've got my own ideas about where it came from, and I'm not necessarily all that articulate about what they might be, or maybe not remember what it was at the time. But in general terms, I like the idea of connecting with people and finding out what it does for them. And I think successful work has that capacity to draw people in and have them come up with why it draws them to it and what it means to them. It's this kind of what I call felt meaning. You get a sense of something without necessarily being able to articulate that in words. And I like that that sense of connection and meaning that is not word-based. It's that instant of recognition before your mind starts attaching words to it. There's that precognition kind of sense about the initial reaction to things that I think is really critical to how you deal with art in general, well, life in general, but in my case with what I make.
Well, I think there's something really strong about that with your work, because even the physical nature of them. I mean, the Raku piece at the end with the horns, or the one in the middle with the skulls, or even the fact that so much of your Raku work, which really so many people know you as the Raku guy from the 80s and 90s, with that sort of that crackle white finish. There's a sense of things also being sort of broken and or weathered, so that there's an implied story behind something, or a long history, even though these pieces are 20 years old, but it looks like it could be 2,000 years old.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I'm working around, is this kind of a timeless sense, kind of a sense of possible antiquity. I have this kind of thing that I've thought of with a lot of work, that it would be something that maybe would be found in the future and be really hard to figure out where it came from, what
this
was
thing was,
what was
yeah.
the period, and that maybe even now you look at it, you know, and you think, where did that come from?
Is it a scientific thing? Is it an idol of worship? Or what is it? What does it do?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a cultural object in a sense, and these really, they have marks and things, but I mess around with glyphs, which are letters, essentially, symbols. And I use a lot of symbols that I make up so that they are not, they're kind of like what you go through when you see cuneiform or something. You have a sense of it being this human mark, and it means something, and you have this sort of felt sense of its portent. And you make a connection with that because it indicates communication, even though you don't understand.
You don't know what it means, exactly.
Which means it could be a grocery shopping list, and you make up some whole world of things it means to you. But that's what I think is interesting about marks like that, is you get this sense of communication that you try to do something with, whether you mean to or not.
That's inherent. You spoke in the beginning about the idea of limitations can either be a launching pad or sometimes they can actually constrain you. And you spoke about, we've spoken at length about the Raku, which in the 80s and 90s was just production. You're throwing hundreds and hundreds of pots and thousands per year of this, but you had to kind of break free from that because you found that quite limiting after a while, right? I mean, there's so many people around, hundreds of people in New Brunswick would have examples of your Raku work from that.
Well, that was the engine of the career for a long time. That's where income came from.
Your
I
family.
mean, that's a reality.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, that was made in the 90s. That was made in the early 90s, and
you're starting to break away from this.
I started using metal. I was always working on other stuff. Some of it didn't find its way into the public, but as early as I think 75 or so, I had shows at the University of Moncton that included mixed media work and bigger pieces. But, you know, I still own a fair amount of that stuff, so something else had to drive. And honestly, you know, when I was talking about limitations, sometimes working with limitations also creates a space for focus, intensity, and to develop a deep relationship with that material and skills. You know, it's, I didn't rail against making that. My curiosity was bigger than that. And I found, you know, repetition and having to come up with new graphic ideas and the way things felt and I never made a piece intentionally that I didn't like. Later, I mean, I opened the kiln or had the firing and might dislike it intensely. And I've seen a lot of crap I've made on people's mantelpieces. But you have to do that to get the things that work. And I think it's the same with repetition. You increase your chances of hitting the mark.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. With the coloration that you've got here, I mean, there's so much of the idea of patina is really strong in your work. And you know, where this one is a sort of antiquated, almost sort of rusty finish, where others are sort of bright colored, and then everything in between where the material is simply it with the casting of the glass or the simple oxidization of the bronze. Where does color come into your work? How do you deal with color and patina?
Well, with patina, it's that kind of verdigris. It just gives it a sense of that kind of timelessness thing. It looks like it's been around. It looks like it's been through some trials and weathered. And it's a kind of a magical thing. We're having the torch and a spray bottle with cupric nitrate and other chemicals, and just watching what's
giving
happened.
your secret away.
I frequently end up doing something quite different than I intended to because accidents happen. And accident is an important aspect, I think, of the way I work, and discovery is experimenting. You have accidents, you end up with things that are wrecked, but you learn something in the process with any luck, although I've returned to the same mistakes often enough. And this is the same with the Raku, for example, with that iridescent glaze. That you just don't know quite what you're going to get. I got better and better at being able to create the conditions under which this happened, but when you yank something out of a red-hot kiln and put it into a flammable material, there's a lot that happens on the way. And I originally discovered that iridescent glaze completely by accident and couldn't believe what I'd gotten.
Tell us about that, because that's so much a part of your work.
Well, with the Raku, that's done the same way, but it's not reliant on reduction effects, where the hot pot encounters a reduced atmosphere that lacks oxygen that it reacts with. This is really just the heat, and the sudden change in temperature makes the glaze craze, and while it's really hot, the smoke from the combustibles it's in stains the cracks. So you get that lovely sense of randomness that I have no control over, other than that designed a clay body and a glaze that did that under the right conditions. And it also mutes the colors, like the colors in there have absorbed smoke and carbon.
That smoky blue
that
is not as
smoky
intense
blue
as
doesn't
it
look
would have been.
smoky blue when it comes out of the kiln and goes into there.
But with the
with
colored
this-
one, it's where you throw it in some of the wood shavings and it just fires up.
Well,
right?
they all do that, but also with this one, it involved. This isn't so much a professional secret, but what I do with it is kind of dangerous, and occasionally there are small.
You don't have to give away your secrets if you don't want to.
It's involved small explosions. I wear a completely fireproof suit with air-supplied oxygen I do all this indoors in a flame-proof room. So I was just messing around thinking, what happens if I throw this in there and then woof, and I got this. So I did a lot. It didn't always work. So that was one of those eureka moments.
So there's play in that. I mean, one of the things about all of these is I find your work, even the real serious stuff, is tremendously playful in not in a childish way, but in something where it's fun. Even your public art, I know the large public art piece near the waterfront in St. John, where it's sort of this kind of archaeological piece of giants. So there's something that's playful there in all of these. I mean, do you consider it sort of play? You're playing with fire, and you're like a grown man. You're melting molten metal, and it's every kid's dream.
Oh, I mean, all this stuff is transformation by fire, and I think of like both pouring bronze, pouring glass, doing Raku. It's a real dance. It's so focusing. It's mountain biking down a steep hill. It's that immediacy of the process that I think imbues the work with some quality of that isn't totally calculated. You set up conditions and you
hope for the best.
You just go into it and use whatever way you can influence what happens, but there are always elements of what you're doing that are enhancing what you're doing, maybe, or not. So that gives it has all those moments when you get something like this, you open the smoky can and you pull it out, and it's just, fantastic feeling. And there are equally other like, oh God, I spent a day doing this. So I like the hot step, that dance.
If you look back I don't want this question to make you sound like an old guy at the end of your career, because you're as active as you've ever been, which is great. But you have this sort of 52-year arc to your career.
Yeah.
And even in these, there's sort of, 20, 25 years almost between the newest and the oldest.
30.
30, yeah. How would you sort of maybe describe or sort of frame that arc, where it sort of started from, where it's going on a big frame, and where you think it could lead to? What are you still looking for today?
Well, it's a very big question. Starting out, you don't know what you can't do. There's a sense of possibility and maybe not enough experience to kind of know enough not to take certain kinds of risks.
Not to take a risk and be adventurous, I'm sure. Yeah.
So everything you're doing at that age is kind of a risk. And so when we built the studio, I'd never built a building before, but we just assumed we could do it and did it. I built the kick wheel. I learned to build the kilns by reading about it.
Yeah, and that was in the heart of the Back to the Land movement too, the DIY time in the 70s when everyone was kind of doing that too, right? So it was in the air.
Yeah, and at the same time we bought a workhorse, and I was trying to haul stuff out of the woods, and we had this place that we bought had all kinds of old horse-drawn equipment, and we had a carriage, and we were running around in the valley in the horse and carriage and doing big gardens. It was such a fecund time, you're just headed off in all directions. But the thing I remember most that I recognize I no longer have is that kind of energy. I mean, we were kind of back to the land boot camp. We worked from the minute we got up till the minute we went to bed. But a lot of it was play, really. And I looked at it, probably didn't seem like it at the time so much. So, I'm kind of losing track of what we're talking about.
Just the arc of your career.
Okay.
See, in the beginning, it was very much, I guess, of the land and personal. And now you're, internationally known public artist, and it's sort of.
That didn't happen intentionally. I mean, I kind of followed my nose, and I was curious and pushed boundaries, and it was a very it was a time when people were like me, were doing other interesting things, and because of the craft fairs that were around, you'd have these kind of tribal get-togethers where you'd share ideas, you'd see what other people, you just bounce off of other people, and that's always been a big part of my creative life, is knowing other people, other makers, other people who were doing things, first locally, then regionally, nationally, internationally. And those times of intense exchange and creativity with other people, often in areas that weren't even visual arts, musicians and dancers and things like that, just broadened the scope of what was possible and what could be done. And as often failure was as much of an instigation to trying new things as success. And one of the things that you realized in the arts is recessions are kind of bad news. And having gone through, I don't even know how many recessions.
Probably 4 or 5.
Oh, at least 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And galleries closing, going out of business, the arc of some kind of thing, just like there are no sales for it anymore. You can only give so many teapots to your mother. You've got to be able to sell them to keep doing what you want to do. I always said about sales is that it really just was enabling me to continue doing what I love doing. Not that I always loved it, but so as the career went on, there were more opportunities and more influences and chances. I started going to the international sculpture conferences maybe every two to 4 years. Probably did it 4 times. Those were big because there were sculptors coming from all over the world to those. There were great presentations, amazing museum things, but also workshops. And that's where I learned to bronze cast in a two-day workshop. I knew I was interested in it. I'd been getting casting done other places, although I made my own molds. So those intense learning periods were a big part of being able to broaden my scope. At the craft college, they had some fantastic people come through. Robin Hopper, Les Manning, and from meeting Les Manning, who ran the ceramics department at the Banff Center, I ended up being there as visiting artist, and that led to all kinds of stuff. The Banff Center is such a treasure in this country.
Oh no, as an artist or any creative professional, opportunities lead to opportunities, and that's the amazing thing to latch onto them.
So we've been there, because Beth, my wife, and I have gone there, I think for 1 or 2 month stints, 4 or 5 times, and every one of them has been eye-opening and broadening, and you meet lots of people.
What's something that you haven't achieved in your career that you want to achieve?
I don't really think about things that way. I think the things that I've achieved have happened not as because they were goals, but because I just kept working. I think my ambition is to keep working.
Well, you certainly do that.
And producing, and not at the level of intensity that I have in the past. It's nice having a little more space in my life. But we're also wed to this place that I'm beginning to be, not quite a full-time handyman, but it's getting there.
Things are fixing. Well, it always struck me as, you are the youngest person I know in their 70s, which I still find remarkable, because when I look at you, I don't know how you've done it. But it sounds like such a cliche, but it is a remarkable career that you've done, and the fact that you're still so intensely doing it now, and working in again, your sort of broken vessels that you're still putting together with bronzes. It's wonderful work, and I know in working on this was a tremendous joy working with you and Beth on this, and it's a remarkable document. I know that the books are still available. If you want to get these, you can get them either online at gooselane.com or at your fine local bookstores. But the book did really well, and I don't think we talked about this, but it actually did far better even than we thought. Because, normally, it would be released with the exhibition, right? Which didn't happen.
Right.
And so there's this trepidation. Would it just sort of sit in boxes? Not at all. They were flying off the shelves, because it's such a remarkable, beautiful document of a lifetime of work. You pick any page, and they're just sumptuous pieces.
And, one of the I love many aspects of this, but in a way, it's an example of collaboration. That book is much more than me or a series of pictures of things. You were as editor and essayist, you managed to focus and bring things out and involve other people in working with Goose Lane. It's just, I'm so happy with that.
Well, and the authors too. We've got Rachel Gottlieb and Peter Larocque, New Brunswick Museum, John K. Grandy, and Alan Bentley. It was the last thing the great Alan Bentley wrote was this essay, and then sadly passed away a few days later, but he was so proud of getting to see you and work with you on this. But so I'd encourage people to see this, but the exhibition will be coming here to the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, going to see probably about 170 of your pieces. So if you think 5 is a lot, you see 170 of them. And it's going to travel across the country, and that's going to open here later next year. But we're actually the end spot on its national tour. But Peter, look, thank you so much. We could talk for hours about this, but I really want to thank you for just being a great friend, certainly not only to me, but just to New Brunswick. And your work is fantastic, and you and Beth, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Great talking to you. Great working with you, too.
Thanks. Thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you next month for another episode of Conversations. John LaRue at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery. Thank you.